Dance mode. While I do consider this as an amazing episode, this one just seems to stand out beyond comprehension. Like, good grief. This, plus, it actually teaches that sometimes, because someone says yes, it really means no. I'll put this episode in A tier. Hammerbarn. I really don't exactly enjoy this episode, considering it is just atrocious. Considering it's just really that. It's just really, really horrible. Which is why I'm going to do something impossible. I'm placing this one in E tier. Featherwand. Now, this episode I feel like has quite the Lord of the Rings reference. Not to mention it tackles the topic of FOMO, which I feel like a lot of us could relate. I do too, since I've had to miss out a lot more than I thought. But I still learn to create my own fun while feeling left out, which I think is what makes this episode rather exceptional. And there is, of course, no replacing that. I'm going to place this one in A tier. Squash. Now, this episode I feel like is just wow, considering it's a friendly sibling rivalry. Even though some would think that the older siblings always beat the younger ones, but being the younger sibling myself, I strongly disagree. Because sometimes the younger siblings beat the older ones. And I actually like how this episode teaches about letting, about friendly games. Well, actually, it shows a friendly game of squash, which is considered the custom in Australia. A tier. Hairdressers. Now, this is an episode I really don't want to talk too much about, considering it's about one finding their ears and the other finding their voice, which I personally concur. So, let's say C tier. Stunpfest. Now, this episode teaches that sometimes that grown-ups do play games, but it's just different. The games we play as grown-ups is just different for us, which I personally do things differently than kids do these days. And that's just a fact, because we actually do. And of course, this is actually going to be quite an episode. This episode is actually surprising, to say the least. So, I'm placing this one in B tier. Favorite thing. Now, this one I don't really want to get into detail for, considering that this one is just wow. I would not even know what to say about this episode. Like, what is there to say? It's just wow. I'm not sure if I'd enjoy this one. Let's say B tier. Daddy Dropoff. This one I feel like explores how the kids like to mess with their dad. My dad usually likes to mess with me, and that's no joke. If you've seen my if you've seen my other videos if you've seen my discussion videos, C tier. Bingo. And now we get an episode where it focuses heavily on Bluey's baby sister, which I think is pretty adorable, since we actually get to see what it's like for then 4-year-old Bingo, trying to make up her own fun with Bluey away. Let's see. B tier. Rug Island. Sometimes I wonder why this episode even became a thing these days. It's like, you never know what's gonna happen in there. Like, I'm not sure if I'd enjoy this episode as much. So let's place this one in D tier. Nope, C tier. Charades. Okay, this one I really don't enjoy. Considering this one is just ew. Like, this one is pretty horrid. Let's say this one is E tier. Sticky Gecko. Now, this one is pretty relatable for parents who've had to try to get their kids out the door on time. I mean, I personally keep trying to get through on time, but it's a problem. Especially with my very busy lifestyle. D tier. Dad Baby. Now, this episode, I personally feel like just proves that that women do not have it easy when they're about to have a child. Like, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't want to live through this because I already know what a nightmare it is for women to go through with that. Let's say S tier. Mum School. This episode, I feel like, is not exactly one that speaks to the kids, but rather to the grown-ups. In retrospect. Because, like, this episode, I do not think I would enjoy that much if I was a kid. But looking back, I think it's actually something for an adult. Especially adults like me. Good grief. Let's say B tier. Trains. Ooh, now this episode is actually one that can be proven that sometimes conductors train-wise, the train's conductors don't have it easy, as they often have problematic passengers, especially ones that just cause mayhem on the train. Let's say E tier. Army. Now, this episode is pretty impressive by my standards, considering we're introduced to Jack, who has ADHD. Yeah, and of course, we actually get to learn about it. It's pretty amazing. Let's say A tier. Fancy restaurant. Now, this episode actually might prove that this one might have actually been quite disgusting with its quote-unquote special. This feast, considering it looks more disgusting than incredible. Not to mention, it's super nasty. Let's say that this one episode is D tier. Piggyback. Now, this episode, I'm beginning to say, would be different from the rest. Consider that this one is just bingo constantly begging for a piggyback ride. Like, that's ridiculous. Yeah. D tier. The show. Now, this is actually one that actually discusses a very mature topic, miscarriage. This one is actually pretty crazy. Good grief. I would not have expected this episode to have managed to thrive instantly, but unsurprisingly, it thrived regardless, which makes it amazing. A tier. Ticklecrabs. Ooh, this episode I feel like is just not my favorite. Considering there's not much to talk about with this episode, it's just there for a reason. It's just there just because it's a Bluey episode. Like, I would not even know where to begin on this one. This one is D tier. Escape. Now, this episode is actually one that got experimental, and I feel like it's just amazing because as we actually get introduced to one of the butlers of the Bluey and Bingo's dream house, Jerry Lee, a science butler. Now that, and honestly, this episode I feel like is pretty impressive considering it's just, like, I don't even know what to say about this one. Like, I'm putting this one in S tier. Bus. The grannies return in this episode. Now, they make appearances at least once a few times. Throughout the series, but I feel like this one was just not a good one. I mean, it wasn't as good as the first time. Which is why I'm going to put this episode in E tier. Queens. Now, this episode actually is kind of like a reference to monarchies, including the UK, which of course, to me, that feels like a reference to what Queen Elizabeth II was before her passing in 2022, who, at the age of 96, I personally think this episode is quite a tribute. I'm putting this one in B tier. Flat Pack. This episode, I feel like, talks about the theory of evolution. I mean, personally, I would actually find it easy to teach a child to the theory of evolution. Which is why I wouldn't advise towards teaching it at some point, but this is pretty hilarious. Let's say C tier. Helicopter. Now, this episode, I feel like, just doesn't really do much talk in conversation, considering it doesn't seem to be all that impressive, if to me, in my opinion. But I feel like this one is just wow. Like, I wonder if it's just trying too hard. I'll say E tier. Sleepytime. Now, this episode was also experimental, and I feel like that was quite sensible at the very least. Considering that this is actually quite an interesting episode, I'll have to admit. It's just like, woo-wee! Like, this episode was pretty amazing, I'll admit. I'll say A tier. Grandad. Now, this episode is quite interesting, considering it talks about how the parent-child dynamic shifts, with grown-up kids looking after their elderly parents. And I feel like I might be trying to do the same, especially with my uncle and aunt after everything they went through throughout my childhood. Let's say A tier. Seesaw, I feel like it's just one to teach kids that everybody should be caring and inclusive, especially since if you involve every friend and it'll be able to tip the scale. Like, there's no replacing that one, and there's just no replacing that. It's just that good. Like, I'm not joking, it really is that good. Which is why it is going straight to S tier. Movies, I feel like, it's just is very cinematic. Actually, it's very relatable since up until 2021, I went to the theaters. Here's which with 2021 being the last time I ever attended a theater. Which, of course, a lot of it's relatable as we pay for This is just proving perfectly. Let's say A tier. Library, I feel like, just doesn't make sense considering that Muffin is firmly believing that she is the most special kid on the planet, when in reality, no one is life's number one star. And that's just a fact. No one is. Even celebrities count for that reason, but they are still special though. B tier. Barky Boats, I feel like, talks about the fear of growing up, as it is no joke that leaving your childhood behind can be a scary thing. I mean, I personally have problems having to grow up, considering I too find it dreadful these days. Not to mention it's pretty hard being a grown-up sometimes. I'll actually discuss about it sometime. S tier. Burger Shop. Now this episode I do not enjoy. Because, like, the kids end up staying in the bathtub, and they're always getting tired. And as they continue to stay in the tub, they begin to feel freezing, to be freezing up, which is actually not a good thing for you to stay there. D tier. Circus actually discusses about leadership, especially when in Queensland there's the voting day, and you have to vote on a person based on who you believe would be a great leader. This episode proves that perfectly. Like, let's put this B tier. Swim School. Now that's an episode that's just wretched, as it proves that sometimes people can be hypocrites. And that's just not great to teach, but still is true. E tier. Cafe. Now that's an episode worth watching, I feel like. This one just talks about a lot of things, but still manages to make quite an impressive proof of how kids make friendship real fast, whereas for grown-ups, it takes time to make a friend. That's relatable. B tier. Postman. Now that's an episode that actually talks about how conflict resolution is important, especially after a squabble or a fight breaks out. Good grief. Like, good grief, this episode is one of something, I must admit. But I don't know what. D tier. The Quiet Game. Now that episode actually explores how Bandit, Bluey, and Bingo have to get a moonlight unicorn earned for Muffin, and the girls are the only ones who know which one she has, or which one she wants. It's with Alfie as a guest star. S tier. Mr. Monkeyjocks. Now this episode, I feel like, is just a crazy way of teaching about giving to those who need it. It's especially with those who how spoiling can make you miserable. Being spoiled can often make you miserable. Being greedy makes you grumpy. let's say E tier. Double Babysitter. This episode, to me, is just wow. I don't even know what to say about this one. And considering it's I don't even have any comments on this one. It's just, I'm not sure if I would enjoy this one, or if it's just that crazy. As it seems, considering it is A tier, bad mood. Now this episode, I feel like it's just proof that it's just not a very friendly episode. I mean, I would never have said if I would enjoy this one. Plus, why would I say that? It's not even worth watching this episode, in my opinion. Which is why I'm going to put this one in D tier. Octopus. Now that's an episode that focuses on Chloe, his family. And of course, we know that her dad and Frank is actually different from Bandit. Which there's not really one way to parent or live. C tier. Midnight. Now that's an episode that talks about how how kids have to deal with a bully or a jerk, or in life. Like that, for me, that's dreadful. Considering I've had to deal with bullies myself. Well, especially in high school. I practically did not have a good time throughout high school, but I'll talk about that later. Let's put this episode in B tier. Muffin Cone. Now that's an episode that could be worth talking about, as it's proof that some kids have a bad habit. For some, it's nail biting. For some, it's sucking their thumb. I mean, I remember I used to do that when I was a kid, but I eventually grew out of it as as I have eventually started to feel it became an embarrassment. That's what teaches kids that bad habits must be broken. A tier. Duck cake. Now that's an episode. Considering it's actually this first part of the Bingo birthday special. Well, two-part Bingo's birthday special. Well, considering the first part actually revolves around Bandit's attempt to make a duck cake for Bingo's birthday, which I personally would have loved a special cake for my birthday, hopefully when I turn 21. C tier. Handstand. Now that's an episode I'd like to talk about, as it actually takes place during Bingo's birthday party. And yet she's doing it, and throughout the episode, she is trying to do a handstand, while Nana, or Chris Healer, is actually trying to get someone to lend a hand to allow her help them. A tier. Road trip. Now this one is quite amazing. This one, I feel like, is just, I don't even know what to say about this episode. Especially with some of the parts being quite crazy. Especially with when playing cow jump. That's pretty funny. Let's say C tier. Ice cream. Now that's quite relatable. Actually, not for kids, not for grown-ups. Well, actually, I feel like ice cream would have been one of my favorite things to enjoy, despite my lactose intolerance, and that's no joke. I'll say A tier. Dunny. Oh, now the word Dunny, for those who don't understand what it means toilet. And of course, that's the whole context of this episode. Even though this is actually pretty hilarious. I'll say S tier. Typewriter. Now that's an episode that seems something like Lord of the Rings and Indiana Jones. Well, actually, it's a mix between Indiana Jones and the Lord of the Rings. Things, personally, I would think. Like, I'll say that this one is C tier. Baby Race. Now that's an episode that focuses for grown-ups, as it talks about being a parent for the first time, especially with firstborn kids. Like, good grief. A tier, Christmas Swim. Okay, now this episode focuses on a very authentic Australian Christmas, and I personally think that it is such an episode that can't be beat. Especially with its customary Australian Christmas. Let's say it's S tier. Easter. Now that's an episode that heavily focuses on an Easter egg hunt, even though the real meaning of Easter is different. As the real meaning of Easter is what the Son of God's or Jesus' sacrifice for us as ransom for our sins. That's what Easter is really about. But this episode's still amazing. It's S tier.